The Australia Energy Market Operators 2023 report warns Australia could face a decade of uncertain power supplies and is calling for urgent investment to safeguard the nation's grid from blackouts and power delays. Joining me live is Nationals leader David Littleproud. David, thanks for joining us. How worried are you about possible blackouts?
Well, not just blackouts, but also price rises. We're continuing to see on the July 1 that prices went up from over 25% because of this reckless race to 82% renewables by 2030. There is a place for renewables and there's a time to do it. And what this government has done is they've exacerbated and brought forward much of that pressure on themselves. Our international commitment for net zero is 2050, not 2030. And so what we've said from the start, and the first thing I did as the Nationals leader, was to write to the Prime Minister and say, let's have a National Energy Summit. Let's put all our cards on the table. Let's actually work through this sensibly about how we can actually reduce our emissions, not just with renewables, but also with carbon capture storage for our coal and gas assets, as well as look at the emerging technology, which is nuclear, particularly small-scale modular. And that is a decade plus away. And that's why we should have that conversation now, because if we don't do it and you go down this reckless race, we're having to put up over 22,000 solar panels a day, 40 wind turbines a month to meet that commitment of 82% renewables by 2030. And then you've got to plug them in with 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines. And someone has to pay for that. And that's what we're paying for now. Chris Bowen and Anthony Albanese have sent all the wrong investment decisions to our investors and effectively have said to gas, we don't want you. And they're not, they're leaving. Coal, you're gone. And nuclear, we don't want you. And renewables can't do it all. And everyone's paying that for their bill. And now AEMO is saying there's a reliability issue. Chris Bowen needs to understand he's got this wrong, be big enough, and Anthony Albanese needs to inject himself in and show the leadership and say there's a better way to do this. Let's have that National Energy Summit that the Nationals called for.
Switching topics, and my colleague Andrew Clennell spoke to Opposition Leader Peter Dutton this morning. Peter Dutton is vowing to deliver a second referendum if the Indigenous voice to Parliament fails on October 14, maintaining that he sees the current voice proposal as divisive. What are your thoughts on a potential second referendum?
Well, this proposal is divisive. You only have to look at the polls. And the Prime Minister's been told on a number of occasions that if this was just about constitutional recognition, I sense that over 80-90% of Australians would support that. But unfortunately, he's conflated what isn't a new model, what isn't a new proposal in The Voice. The Voice is something we've had before. We've had a representative body before. It's called ATSIC. And for us that represent rural and remote Australia, we live with the consequences of that. We need a better bureaucracy, not a bigger one, a forensic audit of the over $4 billion that's been spent to close the gap. But where Peter Dutton is where the Nationals have been for some time. I've been saying for well over a couple of months now is that there'll be no victory lap from the Nationals if this referendum goes down. But if there is a proper process around constitutional recognition, which is a constitutional convention that all Australians can turn up to, not one that he's relied on, where only a cohort of the population were able to go to Uluru and have their input about what the change of the Constitution should be, then we are wanting to be a constructive part of that. So Peter Dutton is right, and the Prime Minister was disappointingly, I thought, overreached when he said, when launching the Yes case on Wednesday, when he said this closed the door on constitutional recognition. What you want is your political leaders to show leadership. And when you've got it wrong, and you've got the question wrong, you should go to the intent of what Australians want. Australians want constitutional recognition, but they don't want a voice. And the Prime Minister hasn't been big enough to see that. We've asked him to show some courage of leadership. We'll still be there regardless, the Nationals. And now Peter Dutton's joined us, and I think that's a good thing.
Andrew Clennell also spoke to Peter Dutton about John Farnham giving the approval for his iconic hit song, You're the Voice. He mentioned some of the lyrics, try to understand it. In those words and in the song, I should say, to become the official anthem, what do you think? Do we need to have You're the Voice as the Yes anthem?
Oh, look, it's a catchy tune from the 80s, but this is far more serious than just a catchy tune. And the fact that the Prime Minister hasn't been prepared to give all the details to the Australian people about how this voice would work, what are the mechanics of it, says that he doesn't trust the Australian people. If you aren't prepared to bring the Australian people into your trust, then why should the Australian people trust you? The Prime Minister's had every chance. In fact, he's got the next 2 weeks to table the legislation of the voice and the mechanics of it, not just for politicians to see, but I think for all Australians to see. This is a deeply personal decision for them. And catchy tunes and vibes don't actually cut it. What cuts it is giving the detail about how you want to change the Constitution, something that is a sacred document to our democracy and to the people who have fought for it and protected it for generations. And we are now the custodians of it. We've got a responsibility to know what we're voting for. And unfortunately, this Prime Minister's put a proposal he's not prepared to share. He's got 2 weeks to do it. If he doesn't do it in the next 2 weeks of Parliament, then he doesn't trust the Australian people. I just say to them, forget the tunes. Just don't trust the Prime Minister.
We have to wrap it up there, but Nationals leader David Littleproud, thank you as always for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.